Tonight we're going to take a look at J. Haldeman's The Forever War. This novel won the Hugo in 1976 and the Nebula in 1975. Now, J. Haldeman is a Vietnam War veteran who was also a physics major. So what do you get when a physics major who's a war veteran writes a science fiction novel? Well, you get one of the greatest military science fiction novels of all time. So Earth is at war. They're at war with these alien beings called the Taurans. And the book begins with the story of Private William Mandela, who's this new recruit for this specialist force who's been enlisted to fight with these alien beings. And the book in many ways is autobiographical in nature because even the main character, Mandela, is a near anagram of J. Haldeman. And we also find that the main character in this novel is also a physics major. So it's very autobiographical in many ways. So Earth is at war, and we find this new recruit in Private William Mandela, who's sent to this, him and the rest of his platoon are sent to this out of solar system planet to start getting some training. And it's absolutely freezing on this planet, and they're getting used to their combat armor. They have these special powered combat suits which they use in these very unforgiving and deadly environments. And they're also using live rounds and getting used to their new modern weapons. And there's a whole lot of death that happens by accident during the actual training exercises. And straight away we find that he is a survivor of the training and is automatically enlisted with his first real combat mission. And things sort of don't go the way you normally expect science fiction novels to go, but is what is one of the highlights, I think, of this novel, which sometimes is missed, I think, by some people. And that is that in this novel, it portrays a very realistic view of war, because we have a Vietnam War veteran who has seen combat, who's reading a science fiction novel. So I want to also address something in this review that I don't normally do. So I want to give you a bit of a plot overview, like I've begun, but I also want to talk to, what I enjoyed about the book, and also address some of the criticisms I've seen in other reviews online. And I don't normally do that. I don't normally read reviews before I do my own reviews, but this is a book I read 20 odd years ago, and over the years I've read up on the book. I just one of those books that I enjoy, and I have seen some criticisms of the novel that I also want to address. So if you're interested in that, I'll encourage you to stick around to see what my thoughts are in rebuttal to some of those criticisms. So the book, they've seen the real combat. William Mandela's seen his real combat, and there's absolute carnage. They absolutely kill a whole lot of Taurans who showed no physical will to fight back or no resistance whatsoever. And it was a complete carnage. And that's because they've been wired basically through their training, through hypnosis, etc., to have this killer instinct to kill all Taurans. And as soon as I sighted one of these Taurans, it just kicked in, and it was an absolute massacre. And so this happens. It leaves a couple of these soldiers, or most of these soldiers, quite shaken up, and they return to Earth. And something like 30 years has passed between their combat experience and them returning to Earth. And you may say, hang on, 30 years? What's going on here? And the reason that is because there's a very interesting form of travel in this book, faster than light travel, in the form of what Haldeman calls collapsars. And these collapsars are basically these fields, and I won't go much into the science of it, but because the book doesn't either, and I don't claim to be a physics major here. But basically what happens is that if you're traveling at a certain speed and you approach one of these collapsar fields, you will continue on that trajectory unobstructed through to another collapsar field, which could be a different part of the galaxy light years away. And that travel distance between the collapsar fields is instantaneous. So there's zero net time elapsed for the people during that elapsar field. So what we find is that they go and fight all these Taurans in their first combat experience and then return back to Earth through these collapsar fields, and 30 years have passed. The life they find on planet Earth and the society they go back to is very different to what they left 30 years ago. And that is in that Earth is in a pretty sour place. It's not a very pleasant place to live. It's overpopulated. The use of weapons is profound. There's a lot of murder. There's a lot of violence, and it's just not a very good place. So what the government is instigated to combat some of the overpopulation, they've really, and these are all the world countries, the countries of the world, I've started recommending homosexuality as a way to curb the growth of humanity. So what we find is that these recruits feel a bit alienated, not too dissimilar to what we experienced with combat veterans in the Vietnam War. So they come back to an Earth which its social norms have changed dramatically, and a very unpleasant environment, and they're not being treated the way they were expecting to be treated. And the war's still going on, right? Because of this time dilation, we find that the war's still going, and a lot of the recruits, in William Mandela himself, have decided that, you know what, Earth is not really what we call home anymore, and we want to go forward, and maybe we just re-enlist. And he does that with the promise of just being some physics major on Luna, just doing a teaching course, and that's what he's offered. And he takes him and his lover, Mary Gay, who's also Mary Gay Potter, who's also one of the majors or the captains in the army as well. I can't recall her rank. So him and his lover decide to re-enlist with the promise of being just teaching in a classroom somewhere on Luna. But as soon as they land on Luna, they're re-enlisted and put back into combat position. So probably what happens a lot in the army, I'm not quite sure, I've never been in the army, but from what you see in movies, it doesn't surprise me if Joe Haldeman has actually experienced or witnessed that in his lifetime. If you are a combat Vietnam vet or otherwise, I hope I'm not being disrespectful in any way. I'm just providing a review on the novel. So please feel free to share your experiences if you have been in an army around some of these things. I'm just talking off the top of my head and reading a science fiction book here, right? So anyway, so they're back on Earth. They don't like it. They go back to this, they go back on the promise they're going to be just lecturers or something on this lunar base, and they find themselves re-enlisted. And they go through another battle. They get injured, as in William and his lover, Mary Gay, get injured. And they're then sent back to Earth. And it's been something like another 400 years that have elapsed. And Earth is now even more different than what it was when Mandela was there, because homosexuality is now the norm. So you are homosexual, and if you're not homosexual, you go through some kind of rehab / fixing thing where you are turned into a homosexual. And I want to talk to some of that, and to some of the criticisms I've read online, and my observations of those as well. So we find again that, you know, William Mandela is way outside of his social norm and what he expects life to be. And he's finding that purely on the basis that he has been lucky and he hasn't died, for no real personal merit, he's been promoted through the ranks, and he's now a major. So like we find that, 700 or 800 years have passed. The book spans like 1100 years. So I think it was like 700 years that have passed, and he's now a major, and most of the recruits are homosexuals who can't even speak English anymore. So they speak a universal language, and they're almost amalgamated. Humanity is almost amalgamated, where they've almost bred this one race of human beings, and they speak a different dialect of English, which is almost non-understandable to Mandela. And we find that his recruits are actually resenting the fact that they've had to learn, I think they called it traditional English or universal English, I think it was, that they have to learn universal English just to talk to this queer. They're calling him a queer because he's not homosexual and he still holds on to his heterosexual tendencies. So Mandela is forced to face all these new recruits in what is almost a hostile environment, in a war that has been spanning centuries now, and is on this planet needing to build another base. And they have their final confrontation with the Torrents. And what happens during that confrontation, I won't go into too much what happens there, because I want to leave something to the imagination here as you read through the book. But we find then, and I'm trying not to give away spoilers here, but then we find that he returns back to Earth, and man has changed yet again. And I won't go into the final stages of the book, because I want you to enjoy the book and I want you to read it. But at this point, so it's a very good book. It's well written, and I remember when I read it, it really does read like someone who's experienced war. Right? It reads like what I imagine a real war setting would be, which is there's not a whole lot of glorification here about war. The soldiers involved in Mandela and some of his recruits and other, his counterparts, there's no glory in this. They're at war. Half of them are questioning why they're there in the first place. They're resenting the line of command, and it's almost at odds to what you see in Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, which is just here behind me, which we'll review. And there's a lot of things to say between the differences between Starship Troopers by Heinlein and Joe Haldeman's A Forever Peace. Two very good military science fiction novels, two very different views on what war would look like. And I think both are very worthy of the awards and recognitions they've had, and it'll be interesting to see when we go to the ladder over time and we see how these two rank and compare to each other. The other book that sort of comes to mind as well is Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game, which is another great military science fiction novel. So the three books are going to be really interesting when we go back to our ladder here and see how they stack over time. So look, yeah, very interesting book. I think for me, it portrayed a very realistic view of what war is, which is no surprise given that it was written by a war veteran himself. It doesn't glorify war. It's like war, there's battle, I come home, things are not quite the way I expected them to be. I re-enlist or go for my second tour of duty, right? I re-enlist. I'm in more wars, thinking that, my chances in war are better than my chances if I remained on Earth. I've accumulated a whole lot of wealth through these time dilations, but somehow I still don't find myself at home, in my planet, in my nation, and I'm back in the front fighting these battles again. So now I want to address some of the criticisms I've seen online through different reviews. Not on YouTube, mind you. I haven't seen many of these criticisms on YouTube, but they may be out there. And I just want to address some of those, because when I read the book, I sort of read those criticisms and I felt differently. I thought, no, I don't see it that way. And that's why I thought I want to address the criticisms by talking to what I thought about the book. So one of the first criticisms when I was reading through the book, people call this book like, homophobic of sorts, which is the complete opposite to what I read the book. I didn't see it as a book of, someone being, made uncomfortable with homosexuality or resenting homosexuality. I almost saw it as a pro-homosexuality book where, the way that William Mandela was treated because of his sexual orientation, I saw not too dissimilar to the plight that a lot of people suffer for their sexual identity, right? So when I read it, I didn't see it as, oh, this is homophobic. I saw it as, you could relate to this book, because you could sort of imagine yourself that, this is what happens when people have an orientation that is not the social norm. And I think that's really the point that Haldeman was trying to make is, there's a social norm, and if you're outside of that social norm, you don't feel comfortable, and society may not look at you the same way, or you might not feel comfortable and you want to escape, or you want to go back to war. So I didn't see it as a negative. I saw it as, someone who's saying, well, what happens if you fall outside of the social norm, and how do you feel in that environment? So, the main character in the book is a heterosexual, and he never becomes a homosexual. Although he's not, he's confronted with it, and he feels uncomfortable with it. But I didn't necessarily read any evil or bad intent toward those people. Like I said, I really saw it as, you're outside of the social norm, and what does that look like, both from your sexuality and otherwise. So I sort of took a different spill. The other part is the treatment of women in the novel. And this one is a little more difficult to defend. I mean, there's one line in the book where, it talks to women being promiscuous in the army and shared around, and it was custom and also by law. Now, again, that I've seen some comments online say that this is statutory rape. And look, I'm not going to disagree with you. I would hate to live in a society where, it's law that women have to be promiscuous and sleep around. But I don't believe that's the intent of the book, right? I think, again, Joe Haldeman was painting a picture here where Earth was facing, and as you get towards the end of the novel and you see what happens to humanity, I think this was just a building block to see that Earth already was showing signs of problems, and as Mandela returns and decades then centuries have passed, we see the degradation of society. We see it at its worst, and we ultimately see it at what appears to be at its best in the final chapters of the book, the final pages of the book. So look, I don't defend the statements around the way women are treated, but I also think that he wasn't being a bigot in any way. I just see the book as he's writing a story here, right? He's writing a story to say that Earth was in some trouble, and you can't paint a picture of Earth being in trouble without reflecting some of the evilness that happens in the world. So I saw it as a reflection of evil, not condoning any such behavior. So I don't know, that's my personal view. You can't write a picture of you can't draw a picture of an ugly face without drawing those ugly faces, right? The other thing that I've sort of wanted to address is that I've seen some reviews that talk to it just, all that happens in this book is there's a battle, a whole lot of people die, then there's another battle and a whole lot of other people die, and he goes back to Earth and things change and nothing really happens. And again, I think those people may be missing the point a bit. I think the point of the book is that, right, is that war is never justifies anything, right? War shouldn't be glorified. All that really ever happens in war is you go into battle, people die. In Vietnam War experience was these people, the ones who do survive, come back home to a hostile reception, and they take a second tour of duty, they go back to war, and a whole lot of other people die, and they come back, if they're lucky enough to survive, in a world that may as well be 1100 years in the future, because that's how these Vietnam veterans felt, right? So I think that's part of the point. I think that's part of the beauty of this book, is that it portrays this, for me, what is a realistic view of war, which is not pleasant. A whole lot of people die. Not much happens. You're training, you're eating, you're dying, right? And also another criticism I saw online is that, we don't really see the growth of the characters in William Mandela. We see him rise through the ranks, but we don't really see any personal development. And I think, again, I think the beauty for me in this book is that it's a realistic view of the world, right? Is human beings go through life, they learn, they study, they go to school, they become adults, they become middle-aged like I am. And you know what? There's not this drastic and huge awakening and development through your whole life, right? You hope to always achieve, and that's why I've started this channel, right? You hope to do more with your life, and you hope to progress and, have all those wonderful things. But there's never this cataclysm where you become someone else, and all of a sudden you go from this mediocre soldier to a major who's going to be decorated with all these award-winning, all these medals because you single-handedly changed the fate of the war. I mean, it just doesn't happen like that, right? And that's, I think, again, the beauty of this novel, is you can read it and you can say, you know what, mate, this is really an autobiography in many ways, but it's wonderfully done in a science fiction viewpoint that I think it's just one of the greatest science fiction military novels of all time. Have I rambled on? Probably. But here we are, right? But look, the Forever War, Joe Haldeman's Forever War. Is there something I didn't like in the novel? Nothing really comes to mind, right? In previous reviews, I talked about, what I liked, what I didn't like. In this book, I really wanted to defend some of the things I saw online because I honestly read it differently. And I don't think I'm alone, right? Because this book is rated on top of many people's laters, right? But I just wanted to encourage the people that, may have read this book or glossed through it and seen some of these, what appeared to be negative criticisms of the book. I just don't know. I read it differently. And I thought those criticisms were actually contrary to what I read in the book. And I think that some of the challenges that Joe Haldeman faced in the war are beautifully and realistically portrayed in this novel. So in the past, I talked to, how long ago did I read the book, what is memorable about it, the writing style. And look, I read this book, it would have been in the 90s. And this is another interesting thing, right? I read this book in the 90s. And when I read it, the world was different, right? I'm sounding like a really old man, but I'm not that old. But the world was different. And when I remember reading this book, and I was in my 20s, mid-20s, right, when I read it, it didn't leave the lasting impression I think it will this time round. And I think it's because the world has changed, right? I think, and I don't know if it's my age group that sees those changes or if it's broader than that. But I think the world has changed since I first read this book, and I think I can relate to it more than what I did when I was my younger self. So although I didn't remember much of it, the actual book and the principle of the book I haven't forgotten. So it's going to be interesting when we take a look at the Sci-Fi Shed ladder here and see where this book ranks. Look, thanks for sticking around and listening to my review of this book and my account to some of the criticisms that I've said. But let's take a look at the leaderboard here and see where we're going to place Joe Haldeman's The Forever book. Hugo Nebula award-winning book, one of the best military science fiction novels. There's a couple of them that share that accolade, which we're going to get to at time, so it'll be really interesting to see how those will rank up over time. But let's take a look at the ladder and see how we're going to rank this one. So back at the Hugo and Nebula Sci-Fi Shed ladder here, and we've got yet another interesting choice to make when it comes to ranking these great novels. Never easy. So I'm not going to go through the list today. There's quite a few on there. Maybe I'll do a quick roundup video one of these days to talk to where we are currently on the board and some of the choices and decisions we've made over the time. But tonight, let's take a look at where Joe Haldeman's The Forever War is going to rank on our Hugo and Nebula Sci-Fi Shed ladder. So maybe tonight we'll start at the bottom. So is The Forever War better than Babel 17? I think it is, and the main reason for that is, you know, I really didn't like the ending in Babel 17. I think that lacked a lot. And I also think it feels a lot more dated than what Joe Haldeman's Forever War does. Admittedly, it was written 10 years later, but I don't think there's a 10-year difference as far as the way the book reads. Is it better than Flowers for Algernon? I do. Even though Flowers for Algernon is a great book, in many ways it's just fiction rather than science fiction. I love the book, don't get me wrong. But there's not that many elements of science fiction where I think with Joe Haldeman's Forever War, it does talk to the future, what the future may look like. It talks to faster than light travel. It's a military science fiction novel, so you're talking about, you know, combat, weaponized suits that humans wear and all that kind of stuff. Really good stuff. So there's a lot more science fiction elements to this novel. Is it better than The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester? Geez, that's a hard one. Is it better than Alfred Bester's The Demolished Man? And I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say it is better than The Demolished Man. Because, you know, to address one of the other criticisms I remember reading about this book, about those characters being shallow. But you know what? I've not felt for the tragic circumstances of a main character like I have felt for William Mandela. There's a certain chapter in the book that you can't help but think, man, this guy's life is a tragedy. And I honestly felt sorry for William Mandela, which I think was just surprising. I didn't expect to feel compassion at the time of the book where I was at, and I did. And I definitely didn't get that from The Demolished Man. So I've got to say that there's elements in this book where I think the science fiction is better, I think the physics is better, and the characters for me had a lot more weight than they did for The Demolished Man. Which I'd have to say it was the same for The Left Hand of Darkness as well. I felt a lot more compassion for William Mandela in the novel and the tragedy of his life than I felt for the main characters in The Left Hand of Darkness. Wonderfully written novel. I will give Ursula Le Guin that, and I will always give her that. It's a wonderfully written novel, but I think for me, Forever War tops The Left Hand of Darkness. Is it better than To Your Scattered Bodies Go by Philip Jose Farmer? Both have got very interesting characters. Well, actually, I would say both have got some interesting science fiction concepts. Let me say that. I think the beauty of this book is that you have, as in Joe Haldeman's The Forever War, you have a character that is your everyday Joe Blow, right? He's your everyday guy who is not a hero, is almost an anti-hero in many ways. But you can feel for the circumstances that he's in. You feel the tragedy of his life. But I wouldn't say he's an interesting character, right? I don't remember William Mandela. I do remember The Forever War being a book about military science fiction, but I don't remember the character. But I don't think that's a weakness in this book. I actually think it's one of the strengths. War is full of unknown soldiers, and I think that's what Joe Haldeman has done brilliantly, right? This is a book about that unknown soldier who has been forgotten in time, who I had forgotten. So I would have to say that To Your Scattered Bodies Go, from a memorable book, character-wise, it has more complex characters, a lot more memorable characters, with a lot more complexity, that is lacking in Joe Haldeman's Forever War. But I think that's the whole point. So it's a really difficult one. Is it better than To Your Scattered Bodies Go or not? Look, tonight, let's skip To Your Scattered Bodies Go and go back to Way Station for a moment. Is it better than Way Station? Now, the the reason these two books are where they are, Waste Station and To Your Scattered Bodies Go, is because they've been memorable books for me. I've never forgotten them. Haven't forgotten the plot, and I know everything. You know, I remember those books quite vividly, even after 20 odd years. I've got to say, the tragedy of war is such that the unknown soldier is forgotten, which is a tragedy, which is the reason this is a great book, but it's also the reason I'm going to rank it below To Your Scattered Bodies Go and Waste Station by Clifford Simak. A really difficult choice tonight. Man, it could have been here or here, you know, first or second, just as likely. The most difficult choice we've made so far. Look, To Your Scattered Bodies Go, Philip A. Farmer, is it better than The Forever War? In the only respect it is better for me is that it was a more memorable book for me. In every other way, I think The Forever War was a better book. But you know, how memorable these books have been to me has got a fair bit of weight, and that's why Ursula's The Left-Hand Darkness is where it's at, because I really couldn't remember much of that book, like I mentioned in my previous reviews. So yes, I think I'm happy with that, hesitantly, but I think that's where we're going to keep it for now. It's going to be really interesting when we revisit Starship Troopers and the Ender's Game, which are also two very great military science fiction novels. It'll be really interesting to see how they go head to head against The Forever War and everything else on this list. Hey, this has been the Sci-Fi Shed ladder. That has been the Sci-Fi Shed ladder. It's been a pleasure having a chat with you tonight, and I hope you join me next time in the shed.